Grace stared at her reflection in the mirror, her heart pounding. She was 30, unmarried, and tired of waiting. Tony was handsome, successful, and ready to marry her. Everyone said he was a great catch. God, is this my answer, or am I just desperate? She whispered. The wedding invitation designs were ready. The hall was booked. Yet deep down, something felt off. But how could she walk away when time wasn't on her side? Grace had always believed in God's timing. In the beautiful city of Abuja, where dreams were made and expectations were high, Grace had watched many of her friends settle down, start families, and move on with life. Meanwhile, she remained single, waiting on a promise that seemed to be delaying indefinitely. She wasn't without suitors, but each time she prayed, something just didn't feel right. Then came Tony. He swept her off her feet with his charm, his wealth, and his persistence. He wasn't the praying type, but he adored her. God helps those who help themselves. He would joke whenever she spoke about waiting on God. It wasn't ideal, but Grace was exhausted. The pressure from family and friends mounted daily. When Ifeoma, her best friend, got engaged, it felt like the final blow. Grace, don't be too rigid. Maybe Tony is God's way of answering your prayers, Ifeoma had said. So she said yes. As the wedding preparations began, little cracks started to show. Tony didn't like her talking about God too much. He preferred nightclubs to church. When she suggested premarital counseling, he laughed it off. Grace tried to ignore the red flags, convincing herself that things would get better after marriage. But then, one evening, everything crumbled. She overheard Tony on the phone. His voice was low but very clear. Marriage is just a formality, babe. You know you're the one I love. Her heart stopped. She stood frozen, her mind racing. Who was he talking to? She confronted him, and the truth spilled out. Tony had another woman. He never planned to be faithful. He just wanted a good wife for public appearance. Grace's world shattered. She had ignored everything, every warning sign, every nudge from her spirit, and now she was left with nothing but heartbreak and public humiliation. The whispers, the pitying looks, the social media gossip. She wished she could disappear. For days, she cried, questioning God about everything. God, I was tired of waiting, but now I see I almost settled for what was never mine. Months passed, she buried herself in work, sought God more deeply and healed. Slowly, she realized that waiting on God wasn't about sitting idly. It was about preparing, growing, and trusting. She had almost settled for a counterfeit blessing because she feared time was against her. Then one day, during a business conference in Lagos, she met Daniel. He was kind, God-fearing, and shared her values. They started as friends. Then something deeper grew. Unlike Tony, Daniel didn't rush her. He prayed with her, studied the Word of God with her, supported her dreams, and made her feel safe. 2 years later, as she walked down the aisle in a breathtakingly elegant white gown, she finally understood God was never late. As she reached Daniel at the altar, he whispered, "I've prayed for you for years. You're worth the wait." Looking around, she saw her loved one smiling, not with pity, but with joy. Ifeoma, now happily married, and whispered, "Now I see what waiting truly means." That night, as she danced with her husband, Grace whispered a prayer of gratitude. She had almost settled for less, but God had written a love story beyond her imagination. Moral lessons. Waiting on God is never a waste. Rushing into the wrong thing is worse than waiting for the right one. Red flags ignored today will become heartbreak tomorrow. Never silence your spirit when it wants you. God's plans take time, but they are always worth it. Impatience leads to regret, but trust leads to fulfillment. True love aligns with God's will. When God writes your story, it is beautiful. It is more beautiful than anything you could have planned.